Hey MCARBO Brotherhood, we're excited to introduce to you the KEL-TEC SUB-2000 target trigger. Each target trigger starts as a block of 6061 aircraft grade aluminum. It's then CNC milled to the trigger that you see here. It then is tumbled smooth to reduce all the sharp edges on the sides of the trigger to give you a nice comfortable trigger pull. And it's then hard plated with black anodizing for that long lasting hard coat finish that's anti-corrosive and is just as durable as steel. Now, replacing the factory trigger with a machined aluminum trigger is going to be a night and day advantage. As we all know, the plastic factory trigger tends to flex, feel spongy, mushy, even gives that sensation that the trigger pull is much longer than it is because of the flex. Well, replacing that trigger with this machined aluminum target trigger is going to give you that nice solid trigger pull. Now, in conjunction with the MCARBO KEL-TEC SUB-2000 trigger spring kit, it's going to give the ideal trigger pull where it's lighter, smoother, crisper, and cleaner all in one. Now, this target trigger will fit and function in the Gen 1 and Gen 2 of your KEL-TEC SUB-2000, and it's also backed by the MCARBO 100% lifetime guarantee, as always with all of our parts. We're happy to introduce the KEL-TEC SUB-2000 target trigger. Parts and tools needed for this build: the KEL-TEC SUB-2000 target trigger by MCARBO, flathead screwdriver, needle nose pliers, small, medium, and large punch, a razor blade, 2.5mm Allen key, 2 blocks of wood, and a hammer. Before we proceed, let's all make sure we're wearing eye protection for safety, and we'll check our firearms together to make sure they're clear. Check the chamber, check the bolt face, and check the magazine well. All 3 positions are clear. This firearm's clear. Now let's begin by field stripping our KEL-TEC SUB-2000. Take your hammer and your large punch, place it here on the buttstock pin, give it a little tap. It's not going to hurt it. That pin is under some pressure, so it does help to do it this way. Remove the buttstock pin, remove the buffer, remove your buttstock, then pull back on the charging handle, remove your recoil spring, remove your charging handle, it may help to assist your bolt out with your punch. Remove your bolt. Make sure you pay attention to the way this goes in. You can see the calibers there on the side, and it fits together like a puzzle piece. That'll be critical when we go to reinstalling it. And of course, remove the collar. Now there's a few ways to do this. You can take a punch and you can tap it loose. On the Gen 1 there's actually threads under there. On the Gen 2, like this model here, there are no threads, and it's just Loctite. So it's a little more difficult to remove if you have a Gen 2. If you have a Gen 1, you should be able to just twist it off, or if you had a strap wrench, that would be useful too. But ideally we don't want to damage this collar or castle nut too much. So you can use a punch if you're delicate enough with it, or you could use a strap wrench. That would be probably the most ideal way if it works. Then you could also use a rag and channel locks and try going about that way. But we found that just the punch seems to work kind of best, just to kind of tap it loose. And then once it's tapped loose, you should be able to put some MAN on it and get that collar castle nut right off. Next, we need to remove all 10 screws that hold the trigger assembly together. Take your 2.5mm Allen wrench and go ahead and start getting to work. This is the most time-consuming process, but it's not too bad. One thing I want to point out is the screws that I have in this SUB-2000 here are not the stock screws. These are actually an upgraded version that we actually just created They're a 12.9 class metric screw. If you're not familiar with the classes, metric classes, it's kind of like so standard bolt grades are grade 2, grade 5, grade 8. Metric bolt classes are class 8.8, class 10.9, and class 12.9. So a class 12.9 metric bolt would be similar to, say, a standard bolt grade 8, just to give you an idea. So these that I'm pulling out are the metric grade 8, if you will. They're also coated in black. They have a black oxide coating, which is great for corrosion protection, anti-galling. It even reduces light glare, and even aesthetically I think they look better. They match kind of the deep dark look of the Sub-2000. So I'll show you what the stock ones look like just for frame of reference. So here's an up close look of the black oxide screws compared to the stock screws. You can see the difference right off the bat there. These are not coated in anything, just alloy steel. These are coated in black oxide. Give you that corrosive protection and also the anti-galling protection. Now let's flip it over, do the same on the other side. Now let's flip it over. Now grab your small, medium, and large punch. We're going to need that. So we're going to attack the Crossbolt Safety now. We're going to remove the C-clips on both sides. First, we're going to remove the C-clip on the ejection port side, which is the fire side. So the idea and strategy here is to take your small punch, position it, the C-clip, so that it's facing towards you. And so this is why we are wearing iPro, because these little clips tend to fly off. So what you want to do is push these clips towards you, and hopefully the idea is they'll just kind of bounce off of you and land right back on your workbench rather than somewhere underneath your workbench. So it may fight you a little as far as just kind of spinning around. This thing does free spin a little bit, so it takes a little patience here, but it's not bad. There you go. So see how it just bounced. You heard it fly and it just bounced right off me, so that's exactly what we want. Alright, now we're going to flip it over to the other side. I'm actually going to reorient the rifle real quick so that the clip is facing towards me. And then I'm going to push it right off with equal pressure on both sides of the clip. Up. See? Well, you can push it all the way up, but just be careful. That detent will fall out, and just grab it if it does. And there's the second clip, and it flew off and bounced right off me. So 2 for 2 in the clips. We didn't lose any of them. That's good. Now that we got the 2 C-clips and the detent out of the Crossbolt Safety, go ahead and flip your rifle around so the ejection port's facing up, and then we're actually going to collapse the rifle in 2. And we're going to pry the trigger assembly apart. So take your flathead screwdriver and just start up here, okay, and just work your way around evenly. Your magazine release may fall inside like mine just did here. Try to keep everything intact. That's going to make life a little bit easier. But if it does fall apart, don't worry. And also make sure that this magazine release spring is still in place. Go ahead and set this piece aside. So this is what it'll look like. Go ahead and remove your magazine release button. Set that aside. Now, just in case you hadn't seen the MCARBO trigger spring kit installation video, I'm going to run through what these parts are real quickly. So your trigger hinge pin, your trigger return spring, your trigger bar, Crossbolt Safety, this is your sear spring, this is your hammer spring back here, and your hammer tucked into the receiver right here, and then your hammer hinge pin is that pin that's sitting up right there. Now, something we also kind of breezed over in the MCARBO trigger spring kit installation video was how to properly reset the pressure and tension on your trigger guard. Now, as you all know, this trigger guard acts as a release lever for the barrel so that it'll collapse. Now, you see how I just worked it loose like that? So sometimes when you pull off the other portion of the trigger assembly, this spring will pop up and it may look like that, and it'll be floppy like this. If you go back and look at our trigger spring installation video, you'll notice, if you look closely, that we didn't reset this properly, and so we made a note and said, hey, go and look at the printed instructions to do it correctly. Now, flip it over, okay, and you'll see there's some cutouts there. And if we pull this spring off, you'll also notice barely that one side is a little longer than the other. So this is the long side, this is the short side. What we want to do is we want to put the long side in that little cutout right there, and it's going to sit like that. Then we're going to hold it together, flip it around, okay, and we're flipping it around. This is the short leg, so the short leg is where we're going to drive that pressure. Okay, so we're going to slide it on, we're going to take a punch, and we're going to keeping it all together there. Now we're going to get some leverage on that plastic part of the trigger housing, and then we're good. Now we've got pressure again, and there's no spring sticking up. So if you've got a spring sticking up here, you know that you definitely need to reset the tension on your trigger guard. Now let's remove the plastic trigger. Now, before we start, as you know from the trigger spring kit installation video, this sear spring will fly off if you're not careful. So be sure you're wearing eye pro. Everything else should stay in place, but just be gentle when you remove this trigger bar, trigger spring, and trigger, because you may accidentally knock that loose and it will go flying. So what we need to do is take our punch, okay, release some of the pressure on that short leg, and then pull up on the trigger bar, just like I did there. And then we'll go ahead and we'll slide out the whole unit. So it'll look like this: your trigger bar, trigger return spring, and your plastic trigger. Okay, so something else to pay attention to is look at how the trigger return spring is on this hinge pin. The top of the trigger return spring, the long leg, is up at the top. So there it is, and it rests on that little tab. That's the whole point of the design there. So that's why we have a longer leg on the trigger return spring, is so that it'll rest on that tab. The short leg is at the bottom, as you see there. Let's go ahead and just slide this plastic trigger right off. No need to do anything else, but I can show you anyway, just in case it all comes flying apart. Remove this trigger return spring, and we'll even remove the pin. Okay, those are the three parts that make up that trigger linkage. Now let's just look at the two triggers real quick before we put them in. So you've got the stock plastic trigger, and you've got the MCARBO target trigger. Now it's pretty much to spec, the MCARBO target trigger compared to the stock plastic trigger. The main benefits are, obviously, it's one's out of plastic and one's out of a block of 6061 aircraft grade aluminum, CNC milled, tumbled smooth on the edges. And you can see that on the edges there, how it's smooth and rounded to give you a more comfortable trigger pull. And there's no nasty lines or rises in the middle of the trigger. It's smooth and it's clean. So it'll really help you get a more precise feel and comfortable trigger pull when you're actually sitting there engaging round after round after round. You'll be able to comfortably find that sweet spot, whereas this, good luck. So let's go ahead and install the MCARBO target trigger. So putting it all back together, we take the trigger, we take that trigger bar, we take that pin, go ahead and slide that pin into the trigger bar, and then take your trigger return spring. Hopefully you've got the MCARBO trigger spring kit. That's what I've got here. And slide your trigger return spring onto that hinge pin on the trigger bar. And now we've got the long leg at the top. You can see it's already resting on that tab. That's what we want. And go ahead and position the trigger like so. So you've got this little raised portion here. That's what's going to be facing up. So that's up. And then the hinge pin goes in to the top of the trigger like this. So this is the complete unit now. And that's how we're going to install it, just like that. Kind of give you a close view of it. Okay. So make sure your long leg of the trigger return spring is pushing against that tab. And we're going to go ahead and drop this on this pin right here. Okay. Slides on there real nice and easy. Then we've got to set the tension. So take your small punch, put your hand on that long leg and rest it against that tab. Then pull up just a little bit on this pin here, and the trigger bar will rise up with it. Take that little short leg. Alright, this is going to take a little finesse. You may want to use your medium-sized punch because it's a lot of tension. Okay, and then once you get it around this pin here, it'll just set in there nicely. You may have to tap this down. Boom. Alright, we're in there. Adequate tension, look at that. That's what we want. Now before we put it all back together, go ahead and just remove that Crossbolt Safety. It may have already fallen out on you. If it did, it's not a big deal. The reason we're removing it is because we're going to have to set this D10 in properly, and trying to put the other side of the trigger assembly on there and getting the safety to line up properly is just a nightmare. So go ahead and grab the other side of your trigger assembly. Make sure your linkage is in place. Go ahead and check everything. Make sure the sear spring's still there. Everything looks right. There's no little spring sticking up here. Trigger guard tension set properly. So taking the other half, make sure your magazine release spring is still in place. Now it makes it a little easier as well if you go ahead and if you take all the pins and place them on one side. So there they are. Now grab your mag release and a magazine, insert the mag release like so, and then slide your magazine in behind it, and that's an empty magazine obviously, just to keep it in place, keep it all lined up. It really does help. It makes a world of difference. And then we're going to take the other side of the trigger assembly and we're going to match up all the holes and we're going to press it on there evenly, and hopefully we'll get that snap and that clip, give us that warm fuzzy feeling that we did it right. Also remember that we got the mag release spring on this side, the ejection port side of the trigger assembly. So go ahead and place it on. I want to line up that mag release. Oh, one thing I want to point out real quick We put this out in the trigger spring installation video, but if your hammer spring is up above this threaded stud here, it's not going to go back on. This half will not go back on. So just make sure it's down and out of the way, and then obviously make sure everything else is in place. Okay, just slide it on, and even pressure all the way around. Ah, I heard that clip. It's a good sign. Go ahead and remove your magazine. Now we're going to reinstall all the screws on both sides of the trigger assembly. Take your 2.5mm Allen wrench and get to work putting the screws back in. After doing these disassemblies many times, hopefully you've got the upgraded screws so that they're not rounding off and wearing out on you. Maybe not the coolest upgrade, but an essential one if you ever want to get back inside the trigger assembly for a deep cleaning, or maybe another set of upgrades that are coming. Who knows? Then go ahead and flip it over. Do the same on the other side. Alright, once all your screws are in and they're snug tight, not over tightened, we're going to take the Crossbolt Safety and we're going to reinsert that. We're also going to take the detent and we're going to make sure we place that in properly. So first thing though, we're actually going to insert the fire side on the right, okay? And the way we do that, you're going to see this is the trigger bar right here. See how that moves up and down like that? Remember that movement from the trigger bar? So we have to actually move that out of the way to get the safety in. So fire side's on the right, we're actually going to stick the safety side in first, and it's going to rest right up against that trigger bar. Then we're going to flip it over, and we're going to go in from the other side with our punch, and we're going to push down on that trigger bar. And we're going to slide the safety right in. And then it comes through the other side like that. Now we take our detent. And we don't insert any C-clips just yet, because we actually have to go a little further than we normally would. Right? You see that? How it's flush? So we kind of have to get a little more room on this side. Now I'm inserting the detent, and I'm going to take my razor blade and I'm going to press down on the detent. Be careful not to scratch your firearm, and then push it in just a tad. So you just want enough so that the detent is held under by the trigger guard, so there's tension between the detent and the trigger guard where it is right now, just barely in there. It's half in, half out. And then that way now we can get enough clearance to put the C-clips back on. So put the C-clip back on, just stick it on there without disturbing that detent. There you go. Got the click. Now push it through and get the C-clip on the other side, the fire side. There we go. Good to go. Now we're going to reinsert the bolt, the castle nut, charging handle, recoil spring, buttstock, buffer, and the buttstock pin, all in that order. So take the bolt, make sure it's put together properly so you can see the caliber right there on the side. Goes together like a puzzle. Fits like that. Slide that into the receiver and make sure you line up the hole there for the charging handle. Okay, now slide the collar on, or castle nut. Now ideally you would put some Loctite on there and tighten it on. There's so much residual Loctite in this thing now that it's tight. I mean, it's solid. It doesn't go anywhere. Even shooting hundreds of rounds, it'll stay on just fine. So all it really does is kind of just keep this back piece of the trigger assembly together, you know, much like the screws hold the trigger assembly together. So if you want to put some Loctite on there, go right ahead. It's recommended by KEL-TEC. Then take your charging handle and insert that. Move it forward. Take the recoil spring and insert that. Then go ahead and insert the buttstock. Then go ahead and insert the buffer. Get the holes to line up. It actually kind of helps to push the pin in from the other side. Just put some downward pressure on it. Good to go. Look at that trigger. That is awesome. Night and day difference. Just take a look at how it compares to the plastic trigger. I mean, this plastic trigger almost looks like something you'd see in a toy gun. So it really doesn't do the Sub-2000 any justice. This is a real trigger. This is not. I think it looks great. I think that's a heck of a look. Now that we've completed the installation of the KEL-TEC Sub-2000 target trigger by MCARBO, let's do a quick function check to make sure we did it right. Go ahead, charge it, place the weapon on safe. Doesn't fire, good. Place it on fire, pull the trigger. That feels awesome. Go ahead and charge it back with the trigger pulled. You should hear a metallic click. Oh, there we go. And then pull the trigger again. Awesome. Excellent. Hey guys, I appreciate you watching. Thank you for being a part of the MCARBO Brotherhood. And as always, happy shooting.